Welcome to Believing the Real, a series of talks on the theology of the real. And in this episode, episode 11, we will attempt a subversive reading of Shapin's The Scientific Life and read sections describing the work of Weber concerning the de-enchantment of the world. And we will, in fact, emphasize that the idea of Evotrust as a theology of the real is, in fact, a kind of re-enchantment of the real, which views science as the method in which the real becomes embodied in beliefs held by human civilization universally. Hello. Episode 11 in the series of talks about the real and the belief of the real. For there is no reality outside our belief, but not as Descartes construed it as the workings of a fervent individual mind for which all other reality is illusion, but rather the illusion that we construct as humans through intersubjective space. It is the reality that we as humans agree on that is the real for each individual. So beyond the encounter with the empirical, there is an infrastructure of thought, of conjecture, of ideas about reality that mediate our meeting with reality. As we saw in this particular slide, that I created for showing this. Here it is. The real, what we perceive as the real, is mediated by trust in majority opinions regarding the ideal, regarding what we think of as reality. And we are pursuing this theory about the way that theories construct our reality through perusal of Shapin's book on the life of science, or the scientific life, which we will now continue to look at. He's describing transformation of science from the realm of creative individuals to the realm of institution that we know today. So he calls it for the transition from calling to job. And let's start looking up at a few segments that I've marked out on this text. So let's start off with this section dealing with moral equivalence and the disciplines. I am reading from Stephen Shapin's book, The Scientific Life, on page this is page 21. Okay, so writing during the Second World War, with the existence of both liberal science and liberal society under threat, the American sociologist Robert K. Merton announced that there was nothing special about scientists as people. Passion for knowledge, idle curiosity, altruistic concern with the benefit to humanity, and a host of other special motives have been attributed to the scientist. The quest for distinctive motives appears to have been misdirected. There is, he said, no satisfactory evidence that scientists are recruited from the ranks of those who exhibit an unusual degree of moral integrity, or that objectivity of scientific knowledge proceeds from the personal qualities of scientists. Merton's insistence on what I call the moral equivalence of scientists is now a commonplace, but it was not a commonplace at the time that he gave voice to it, and he was good enough a historian to appreciate aspects of its novelty. This chapter describes how, why, and to what extent, and with what consequences late modernity's most powerful knowers came to be portrayed as ordinary people. It is a story that bears upon the authority of techno-scientific knowledge and of the institutions that house that knowledge. So Shapin is setting us up here to what he's going to describe as the normalization of science in Kuhn's terms. What he actually is going to describe here is the fact that each and every scientist is not some particular genius or virtuous individual or some kind of guru that we would intuitively consider to be a harborer of truth. But in fact, the scientific institution is perceived as such by everyone, including the scientists themselves view this institution, the academia, the working of science, or as Shapin is going to describe, technoscience, the true advancements that we have now in science, as something of a phenomenon capable of providing truth. So as we discussed previously, obviously we are talking about the egalitarian phenomena that characterize human groups in their most pristine state, such as hunter-gatherers who are egalitarian, as we saw when we surveyed Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Minds summary of human evolution, and understood the way in which our abilities as humans to create an inter-subjectivity, a space where the mind of others is assimilated into our own mind, becomes the basis of our own individuality, is the basis of our perception of the real, of what is true, what we believe to be true. And if throughout history this was based in many ways on traditions, on charisma, and on authority, now all these are being pooled in a trust pool within a trust pool. The scientific community within general population that strongly adheres and believes to the scientific community. But inside the scientific community, there is exactly what this what Shapin describes here as moral equivalence, i.e., scientists are no better than other people. They are not popes, they are not rabbis, they are not gurus. They are ordinary people pursuing a very specific pursuit. So Shapin is now going to describe for us how this came about. Okay, let's continue with a bit more of Shapin. Moving on to another quotation on page 23, which expands on this subject. The philosopher Karl Popper was in wholehearted agreement with Merton's sentiments. And of course, Popper is very central to our argument, as you see in our habitual slides. We are quoting Popper, refutations and conjectures, his classic book, Conjectures and Refutations, about the way that science does its business. We've co-opted that, the refutations bit, to describe what we view as the real. The real can refute and in fact also corroborate in our minds what we believe in, and also the conjectures part is what I consider the ideals, or the dogma, the doctrines. You see that I lump them all in under one heading. So this is Popper subsumed into our argument, because I believe this vision of Popper, although I think he took it into a sort of prescriptive mode, that is very problematic, because that's not really the way that science progresses. As we said time and again, scientists do indeed go for corroboration and confirmation. They suffer, like all of us, from confirmation bias. They want the theories to be true. But because it is a groupthink, because it is the majority opinion that is trusted, and the majority opinion that will determine what will be construed as truth, then ultimately the refutations part and the conjectures part are part and parcel of what science is on about. Because everything that is dreamed up by an individual scientist or by a small group of scientists is subject to peer review, is subject to majority opinion, and that majority opinion can swiftly disconfirm, can swiftly refute whatever theories are found to be incompatible with prior knowledge, so that in fact science, through this group mechanism, through this majority vote in what will be considered real, practical, applicable, and so on, becomes in fact a bastion of dogma vis-a-vis everyone outside the discipline. Because what the discipline decides within it through majority vote is the description of reality, the conjecture that we adopt at the moment becomes dogma for the rest of humanity, who are not privy to the internal discussions. In this way, persons with moral equivalence who are not particularly outstanding in any sense, although some of them can be very outstanding, but that doesn't matter. It's the majority vote that creates ultimately the perception of what is real, of what actually is perceived as what science discovered about the world. And this does not depend on the talents of the individual, as we saw. It depends on the we, the majority vote, the majority opinion. So let's read a little more from the quote from Shapin. I'm on page 23 here. So Shapin brings Karl Popper here in line with Merton's words about moral equivalence. In Popper's 1950 essay on the sociology of knowledge, while not mentioning Merton by name, he noted that scientific objectivity has the character of a social institution. What we call scientific objectivity is not the product of the individual scientist's impartiality, but a product of the social or public character of scientific method. And the individual scientist's impartiality is, so far as it exists, not the source, but rather the result of this socially or institutionally organized objectivity of science. In Popper's view, what was fundamentally wrong with the then current sociology of knowledge was just its individualism, its naive presumption that scientific objectivity had to be grounded in the individual scientist's impartiality or objectivity. We are all suffering under our own system of prejudices, and scientists are no exception to this rule, even though they may have purged themselves from some of the prejudices in their particular field. So you see that indeed we are talking about a group that works according to certain institutions, social institutions that call for a certain methodology that preserves objectivity. But in fact, and as Shapin will show, it's not really objectivity here that is at work. Even the methodologies of science can also always be co-opted into forms of scientism that are rampant in many areas of academia, where we use methodology to substitute for the reality or the presence of facts. And in many realms of academic pursuit, where Popper would not talk about them being empirical. For example, I don't know, the science, science of studying in all the non-natural sciences. There, indeed, it is always the true heart of science, the consensus of one's peers, that makes or breaks careers and defines actually the real according to the various disciplines. In any case, in this section, Shapin reiterates the idea that it is not the individual scientists, but the group. Okay. the next section, Shapin writes about the nature of nature and the nature of knowledge. Merton insisted on moral equivalence against the background of what he acknowledged as widespread sentiments to the contrary. I'm reading from Shapin on page 23. His tone was correcting what the early moderns called vulgar errors. Whether these errors were found in other academic disciplines or in the common culture. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, expressions of moral equivalence were rare. By the end of Merton's life, such errors had been substantially eliminated from the academy. It has now become an official commonplace, seemingly in need of no special evidence or argument, that scientists are morally no different from anyone else, and more generally, that the personal equation has been eliminated from the scenes in which powerful technoscientific knowledge is produced. So it is well to remind ourselves of the scheme of things in which the moral superiority of those who spoke truth about nature was itself a cultural commonplace. What did such presumptions look like? How were they sustained? And what did they say about knowledge, the knower, and the known? So, very well and poignantly put by Shapin. In fact, the question that he raises here, and which is for us of interest because we are tracking the evolution, actually, of the way things are done. We are looking at the ladder of progress and perfection, and we have traced it up to the rise of human civilization, and we have seen that we have some very solid groupish pre-wirings, and that these groupish pre-wirings tend to look at authority, to sanctify authority, to indeed hold in trust the elder, the wiser, the alpha male, and place aside our own opinions. So how did we go from there, where authority had a central place in our construction of truth, where everyone believed Aristo, to a place where we believe in an institution that is impersonal, where all scientists are in fact regular individuals with no particular moral standing that we usually ascribe throughout history to the speakers of truth, to who represented for us the truth about reality. How did this come about? And this is the main focus, because and now Shapin is going to fill in the blank for us how in the last 300 years, since the beginning of the scientific revolution, today there came about this shift of the way that we perceive science and the basis of truth, the basis of what we have, the ideas we have about reality, and this transformed from the ideal, from dogma, into conjecture, in fact. So we are going to look at the inside the ideal pole of our ideal and real spectrum, and we are going to analyze that with Shapin and see how this transformation came about. And in fact, we will be able to position ourselves with this, the whole idea here of Evotrust, of believing the reality exposed by the scientific endeavor to be part of a divine plan, to be part of a progression within reality, which is not a divine plan, but the divine unfolding. I have to get out of this mindset that talks about divine plans as if it were the intelligent design mindset, which is completely beside the point, because we are talking here about unfolding of the divine. The plan is not set out by an engineer. The plan is the pursuit of perfection, the pursuit of progress that is the very nature of reality, the very nature of the real. So we want to look at actually the scientific link within this chain of events that we are now riding the crest of. We are now riding the crest of the wave of evolution that has risen to a veritable tsunami at the present time, so that in fact everything around us is construed through the human group mind, through the intersubjectivity and the world of others that we live in and we are part of, and that we construct with others as our world. And we'll get more into that when we go into the construction of social construction of reality by of course, Berger and Luckmann, the social construction of reality, in which they describe the way that all of us as individuals in fact participate in this groupish endeavor that ultimately creates a facticity, a reality in which we as individuals are born into. And this is the human reality. This is the groupthink, the world of others that we are born into. And we saw how this evolved first in hunter-gatherers. There is this level of egalitarianism wherein the alpha male is in fact deposed, and the minds of the group ultimately determine what the real should be, how people should behave, what people believe in. This is the thoughts, the practices, the institutions that are commonly held by us as human beings, as a group. And it is only with the rise of civilization that we had a kind of throwback in which we gave back the position of authority to alpha males, to elite groups, and to figures of authority that played on our pre-wiring and used the human tendency to groupishness, to accept the vision of others about reality as real, in order to subdue, suppress, exploit, etc., many realms, many areas of human society. Many pockets of human society were suppressed, whether according to lines of gender, women, whether according to class, the workers, whether according to property, owner, masters and slaves. There are so many ways in which humanity divided itself into strata, into castes. We see that in India, the caste, where every caste has its own profession, its own place in the structure of reality, and each one knows its place, and knows its function. This was common throughout the world, and even today is common in most human societies, except for the rise of modernity, where this has changed. So again, Shapin is now going to take us through this journey of change, in which, in fact, these very traits of trust and belief have become transformed and focused or reverted to the original human invention of egalitarianism, which is what happens within scientific circles. This groupthink becomes a focus of equals within the discipline. But these equals are equals in the sense that they are all within the same discipline, but they are all required to attain their full humanity, i.e. 10 or 20 years of specialization in their discipline before they get this equal vote, before they get a voice within the scientific institution as part of the majority that ultimately determines a reality in this niche of the world for not just the discipline that they are specializing in, but for all of humanity, who looks to these specializations for its truth, real, its perception of the real, and its progress. So, in fact, within this description of the way that we are progressing, science is both an innovation and, in fact, a realization of the human potential that began to glimmer in hunter-gatherer societies, the actual turning point that made us human, the ability to live in an egalitarian society in which through our minds, through our ability to exist in the world of others, in the world of other humans, we in fact create a world. We in fact establish a world that is mediated by mind in all its affairs. So when surplus came up, and we'll discuss this at length when we talk about money and property in the future talks, when the surplus became large and people could commandeer certain pieces of the plenitude of the wealth that human beings began to amass, we find that human beings stratified, and the even older levels of our existence as primates came to the forefront, but again, not in the old way that characterizes primate societies, where the alpha male rules by might, but actually through human mediations, through the mediation of the mind, so the representation of this hierarchy in mind, so that kings did not rule by might, but by right. And the belief that they had the divine right and the divine position that would allow them to dominate others, that was mediated by the minds of humans, and was not part of the primacy of some alpha male. So in this complexity, we go back to looking at Shapin, and we want to see his description of how things actually developed, transitioned from a human civilization in which authority was given privilege, which tradition was given privilege, to a human society that privileges an institution of individuals who carve out a piece of knowledge about reality that we subsequently, as a society, hold as true, as the truth, as it were. So let's proceed with Shapin. So let us continue with some excerpts from Shapin, and we're now getting to some really paradoxical stuff, fine paradoxality, because what we are actually going to discuss here in a moment is the exact opposite view to this entire enterprise, this Evotrust enterprise, in which we find the rise of science as the further unfolding of the divine. Because the very essence of science is eschewing all these ideas of divinity, or that science exposes anything about the workings of the divine. But what actually transpires, and as we will see, is that this very rejection of the divine rejects the place where human beings were limited by the ideas of single persons that were taken on authority and transformed into the actual heritage of the human kind, which is to work together as a kind. The multi-human, the group that is the world of others created by other humans becomes the focal point of our perception of reality, turning away from previous ideas of authority. And if we will see in a moment, Weber talked about the disenchantment of the world as part of the rise of modernity, then indeed I believe that it is now possible to re-enchant the world while yet sustaining a very strong position of skepticism towards the ability of any individual to actually perceive the real. This is a group endeavor. This is a pan-human endeavor, and it is not for nothing that science, as we know it today, is a global thing that cuts across everything. Nationality, religion, gender. Science is done everywhere, in all countries, in all locations, and the knowledge is pulled together globally. So this is really an endeavor of humanity, and it is important in the way that it took us away from our preconceptions that were embedded in this magicality of the world. And what Weber calls as the magicality of the world, the enchantment of the world, is in fact everything that Haidt describes about our biases, our pre-wiring that tends us to certain modes of thought, to groupishness, to bending our thought, our will, and abnegating ourselves before the authority of others. But now we abnegate ourselves before the authority of an institution that through its constant skepticism and inner critique, through its peer review process, actually allows us to hold on to a perception of reality that we adopt as truth with even greater fervor than any religious truth that we ever held on to. Okay, so let's read a bit inside Shapin on page 25. Weber, writes Shapin, pronounced the demagification of the world, actually the disenchantment, what we call disenchantment. Okay, so maybe this is a retranslation from the German, what some translators call disenchantment. Shapin here rephrases as demagnification of the world, and the death of natural theology in the same essay that rejected any notion that the scientist had the kind of authority that entitled him to pronounce on what ought to be done. The secularization of inquiry announced by scientific naturalists, inspired by Darwin, meant that the object of scientific inquiry, nature, was to be relocated from the sacred to the secular domain. And its case was to be lowered accordingly, i.e. not sacred with a capital S, but secular with a minor s, with a lowercase s. If you are a scientific naturalist with a with capitals, or if you subscribe to their assumptions, then knowing about nature was no longer like knowing a divinely written book, but like knowing how a car engine worked. The automobile mechanic, like the natural scientist, can be regarded as an expert, even a highly valued, powerful, and well-remunerated expert. But nothing uplifting, or at least nothing particularly uplifting, is now officially associated with a scientist's object of inquiry. No morals, no lessons, and no special authority to pronounce on what ought to be done. Weber asked himself what it could possibly mean in 1918 to talk about science as a way to God. He answered his own question. Any such talk must be nonsense. Science is this specifically irreligious power. That science today is irreligious, no one will doubt in their innermost being, even if he will not admit it to himself. Okay, so we are discussing this within an overarching theory of a theology of the real. So we can see how this very vision now fits into the way that Evotrust describes evolution. For in fact, what we are turning away from is a preconception of God, of the divine, as enshrined in tradition, in the way that this conception developed in human civilizations up until the rise of science. But in fact, it is the very irreligiousness of science, its very non-subscription to previous religious dogma, its turn to the real, the way that it turns away from authority to look at the empirical facts, as it were, inspect the real, that gives rise to a new vision of what the world is actually like for us as human beings. For it is this very irreligiosity of science that freed it to look at the actual world as the divine actually unfolds within it, not as something made, not as some object created by an external God. That has been certainly deposed in science, but actually as a divinity unfolding from within. We are that aspect of divinity that ultimately progresses, that ultimately arises. And this is the whole reason for creation. So this specifically irreligious power of science it's turning away from dogma, from previously held traditions that rely on authority, and facing the real. And what is the real? The real is the unfolding of the divine. So rather than the God creator world creation sort of thing, the vision of the intelligent design school that has been, to my mind at least, completely debunked, what actually appears before us now is an evolving cosmos with a distinct trend, and that trend, that thrust of evolution, is the unfolding of the divine. Okay, so what we are actually talking about here is not the extraction of God from the world, what Weber called disenchantment, but actually our disenchantment with previous dogma, with the previous dogma of religion. This is not God that can coincide, can be aligned with what we increasingly know about the real. As Einstein, when he became a theologian, cried out in anguish against the perpetrators of quantum mechanics, God does not play dice. How do you know that God does not play dice? Because he still had the old architect's vision, the whole old designer vision, and could not see that, in fact, God does roll the dice. But that dice gives rise to an increasingly, those dice, that cast of the dice, the roll of reality gives rise to increasingly fine structures of morality, creativity, and everything that is human. So in fact, we are looking at what Shapin brings us, like a vision within a vision. We are co-opting Weber's eschewing of the trust in religion, eschewing of the magicality of the world, in order to bring magicality back in a completely different dimension. Because if Weber taught us one thing, is that what you intend and what you give rise to are two different things. And that is the core, the essence of his the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. That a Protestant ethic aimed at the extra mundane, at actually their conception of the divine, actually gave birth to a whole secular vision about reality, gave rise to capitalism, which was not intended. And the founders of Protestantism, especially Calvin, is quoted by Weber as being quite irritated by the turn that people took to the secular, emerging from his kind of theology into a much more secularized vision of reality. So in fact, we are taking Weber's main idea that human institutions embed thoughts about reality, construct reality, as Berger and Luckmann later developed these ideas more fully. And that constructed human reality is in fact part of the unfolding of the divine. And as it becomes severed from traditions, actually from the fetters of the evolutionary pre-wiring that we saw in height, it becomes capable of pooling these unique human biases into such a structure that actually offsets these biases. The scientific endeavor, as it de-magicizes, de-enchants the world, actually creates a space where the human ability to egalitarianly construe reality through a majority vote, through the majority vision, through inter-subjectivity comes into its own, and in fact allows us to know a lot more about the workings of the world that we ever knew when the world was still enchanted in the old sense for us. So in fact, we are trying to re-enchant the world by looking at it from a different perspective that is informed by what science discovered, that is informed by evolution, that is informed by quantum mechanics. Actually, much more firmly held ideas about the real, ideas that now have such a firm consensus that all of humans can agree to them, regardless of their faith, nationality, creed, gender, whatever. And that has been the great achievement of science. So we are actually reading a kind of subversive reading of Shapin, of Shapin's reading of Weber. Anyway, let's proceed with that reading. So says Shapin, we're on page 25, the severance of a long-standing tradition casually linking scientific inquiry to personal and public morality is indexed by a remark attributed to the Scottish socialist physiologist J.B.S. Haldane in the 1920s. Haldane was in the company of some English theologians who asked him what he could conclude about the nature of the Creator from a study of his creation. And Haldane's response was an inordinate fondness for beetles. The flippancy of the manner is more telling than the substance of the inference. So, okay, so let's read this subversively. What Haldane was saying, you don't know anything about creation, about the Creator, except, you know, he likes beetles, because God must surely like beetles, because there are so many types of beetles in the world. The world of insects is so wide and so developed and so varied and so on. So, in fact, he was saying, he was actually debunking this idea of Creator and his creation, which is exactly what should be debunked. But in fact, the beetles and the plethora of them is the very creativity of the divine erupting as it expresses itself within the real. The real itself is the progression, the expression of the divine. And it's so creative. There are so many variations, so many forms, and they all repeat the same thing, because beetles have a lot of aspects, many aspects that we can look at from this moral, as it were, point of view of the progress of reality. And we can see how these experiments that have been going on throughout evolution that give rise to new forms, new developments, new turning to the other, the Beatles also have a place in that. But it's a creative place. It's an open place. It's the place where from randomality there rises a world. But okay, we'll have a lot more to say on that. I keep digressing because there's so much. Every aspect of this vision has so many implications. And the world of Beatles and the way that these... I think it was Tomasello. I don't remember who talked about the grim sower rather than the grim reaper. In fact, this idea of the grim sower merits a digression here about the fecundity and the creativity, indeed, of this unfolding of the divine. So let me take a leap now into another book, just for a few minutes. So digressing, this is another amazing book, highly recommended. It's called Figments of Reality, The Evolution of the Curious Mind. And this book has provided many of the ingredients that have ultimately led to the development of this vision of Evotrust. And in that book by Stewart and Cohen, or Cohen and Stewart actually, they described the Berger shale, which is one of the amazing points of evolution where we find an explosion of creatures embedded in the rock, in the strata of the rock, about 570 million years ago. And it was so creative. There were so many forms of which we have no modern remaining offspring, as it were, seemingly. But in fact, as we spoke about the birds, that they continue, the dinosaurs, everything is, nothing leaves reality, but certainly evolution makes many attempts. So they discuss this Berger shale, and I'm going to read out to you. It's page 24. As you see, I'm reading directly from Google Books from here. So he writes here, just one of the Berger shale creatures, I'm quoting from Cohen and Stewart, the Figments of Reality, Evolution of the Curious Mind. So just one of the Berger shale creatures was part of the evolutionary lineage that led to humanity. Since most of the Berger shale creatures quickly died out for no obvious structural reasons, Gould is another, is one of the new atheists who says everything that we see, this very trend that we see, this amazing appearance of mind, and everything that we continually talk about as regards the evolution of humanity, it's all by chance. It's all spandrels. So Gould deduces that it's mainly a matter of luck which of them survives, and he inferred that our presence on this planet owes much to Dame Fortune and not much to good design. He's quite right. Fortune, luck, randomness is indeed the way that the divine unfolds in reality. And the whole idea of intelligent design is alien to what we know about actual reality. The way that we as humans, humanity in general, through scientific enterprise, know how to describe reality at the present moment, but always as conjecture, never as dogma. But actually, these conjectures are our most cherished dogma. We just know that perhaps more will be revealed, and then we will alter our vision of reality. Anyway, let's look at what Cohen and Stewart write. They say like this. But is it really so? We give our answer in chapter 5. But whatever the interpretations placed on it, the Burgess shale fossils show that around 570 million years ago, at the start of the Cambrian period, life suddenly became enormously more diverse. This geologically rapid change is known as the Cambrian explosion. The Burgess shale is a dramatic demonstration that evolution can produce rapid and far-reaching changes. But what actually drives evolution? Human beings, conscious of their personal mortality, and are somewhat obsessed with the Grim Reaper, if only because they dimly see him coming and they don't like it. Of course, as individuals, but as a society, as the multi-man, as the world of others that we live in, we are less concerned with mortality. Societies, human groups have this sense of continuing consciousness because each group creates its own identity, and that identity persists across generations. Anyway, let's continue with Cohen and Stewart, and they say, in consequence, the Grim Reaper plays a central role in humanity's usual story of evolution, nature red in tooth and claw, where creatures strive to outcompete each other in a desperate, no-holds-barred battle for survival. Only the winners of these battles, it is said, get to perpetuate their kind. The losers just die, and in this way organisms with good genes proliferate at the expense of all the rest. It's a simple, compelling picture which seems to explain the general increase in the complexity of life forms. However, we will see shortly that this picture of evolution is misleading even for simple organisms. Obviously misleading, obviously not the way that evolution actually unfolds. This is part of the baggage of not even, I think, Darwinian evolution, but post-Darwinians, neo-Darwinians, and all kinds of philosophers who derived ideas from Darwin. I think it was Spencer who talked about red in tooth and claw. No, I think it was him who coined survival of the fittest and so on, the idea of might makes right. This is a completely different dimension, but actual evolution, how it operates, certainly that's not the way it goes. And Cohen and Stewart here illuminate this briefly. They say, in fact, in the evolution of complex organisms and of mind, the central role is played not by the Grim Reaper, but by the Grim Sower, who starts things up by their billions so that nearly all of them have no option but to die before they reach maturity. The popular view of natural animal lives has been romanticized to such an extent that they are universally seen as idyllic, whereas actually the reverse is the case. Nearly all wild creatures die without breeding. For example, the 10,000 eggs that a female frog lays during her lifetime, on average 9.998 die for each pair that survives to replace the parents and breed. A more extreme example is the cod, okay, etc., etc. And here, just because it's on the screen, this is a picture of one of the strange Berger shale organisms. This is a Opibinia, weird creature with all kinds of protuberances that you don't find in usual in the usual animal world. Anyway, the Grim Sower, that's the idea that Cohen and Stewart bring to the fore, and the idea is all of us began life with this. All of us were once, as a part of our genetic heritage is the ovum and the sperm that we emerge from. And most sperm, especially sperm, just disperses and is gone. So the potentiality, it's like the divine, the unfolding of the divine as progress unfolds through opportunity, through the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't mean you're going to catch it, but the opportunity is there, and it's It's like the grim sower. There's so much potential spread out everywhere, and only some of it is realized. But slowly we saw that evolution gives rise to these edifices, these structures that ultimately enfold or encode mind as the encompasser of reality. And today, vis-a-vis this scientific institution that Shapin describes so aptly as being magicized, it is exactly from that institution that we have a much clearer view about the actual unfolding of the divine and a true debunking of the intelligent design idea, as well as the ideas of such neo-atheists as Gould. Because obviously this claim that this is all by chance, that the whole development of mind is something outside of the actual unfolding of the real, and an artifact, as it were. Of course, that's ridiculous when you look at the trend of evolution, which goes contrary to basic evolutionary theory, because Darwinian theory ultimately does not provide enough time and enough materiality to actually evolve the human, to actually evolve Darwin. Anyway, that was quite a long digression. Let us now go back to Shapin and to the flippant idea about inordinate fondness for beetles that took us on our digression. So now we can see that this fondness for beetles is part of the unfolding of the divine as infinite potentiality, as the grim sower, as it were, because life spreads and evolves and gives opportunity for new structures to arise. And from this potentiality that has been slowly climbing out of the Big Bang for 14 point something billions of years, at last we are here, continuing to evolve. And we are at the throes of truly coming into our heritage as humans, as a new form of evolution that resides in the group mind, in our ability to represent reality and then live within it. All right, so let me proceed. Let me continue a bit with Shapin. Let's look at some more of his insights here. So on page 28, Shapin summarizes various forms of philosophical definitions of what science is, such as pragmatism, probabilism, falsificationism, all kinds of views of science. And ultimately, he sums it all up in that they all each aims to sever the links that bound early modern natural philosophy to religion by way of metaphysics and notions of God's truth. Just as the scientific naturalism of late 19th century lowered the case of nature, so all these characterization of the quality and character of scientific knowledge lowered the case of truth. Not truth with a capital T, but truth with a small t. And some indeed quite explicitly identified the metaphysical tendencies of religious discourse as an intellectual pathology to be cured by deflationary concepts of proper scientific knowledge. So as science turned to the real, it also rejected the ideas that were previously held regarding dogma. It distanced itself from previous metaphysical knowledge about reality, and in fact turned to the real as the true place where everything takes place. But in fact, what is not stated here, and I think this is the crux of it, all the methodology of science, whatever or however sophisticated it is, however well construed or constructed it is, the main thing here is the turn to the real. So if we go back to our general picture of the progress and perfection paradigm, the transformation from our ideals to the real, we see that we are talking here, as we said from the outset of this talk, about understanding the interface between the ideal, the dogma, and the conjectures at the top of that scale. So in fact, if before we could talk about dogmas held through authority, through religious tradition and so on, we now have them held through conjectures. Truth becomes, from truth with a capital T, truth with a small t. The very difference between idealism, between an idea, a theory that is held to be dogmatically as the ultimate doctrine about truth, and conjecture about reality. So actually the turn to the real can be found within that very shift from dogma based on authority, on traditions, to the new dogma that is based on the inner workings of groups of scientists that modestly admit that they know not, and they therefore have conjectures about the real. So, and actually the real is what really made science, because all kinds of, when we look at the history of science, there were many conjectures about how reality functions, and only experimental results finally showed up one theory to be better than another, better, as it were, better descriptive of the real. And Cohen, in his Nature of Scientific Revolutions, actually goes in great depth to describe how this process works. And he shows all those great theories hovering around, all those conjectures about reality that were hovering around until science finally finds its feet. And in fact, it is the majority opinion regarding what is the most appropriate description of the real. So in fact, were it not for the real, requiting, as it were, the theoretical love showered by scientists on reality, then there would be no revelations. In fact, the real is revealing itself to us through this medium of the scientific endeavor, this group endeavor in which the majority opinion of specialists in certain disciplines determine for us the truth about reality. And this is actually the revelation of the constantly evolving divine. So, in fact, by turning away from dogma, by making science more compatible with common sense approach to reality and basing it on human consensus, not on authority, but on the consensus of the group of specialists, which again, within larger society appears as the usual format of authority, dogma, and so on. Nobody is going to argue with, as we described at length, with the consequences of the deliberations of chemists within their laboratories. We accept everything on trust, as we always did. We always accepted everything that was human, all the institutions that that are part of our constitution as individuals, on trust. That is the way that we are part of the world of others, the world created by man, which is a facticity generated through our inter-subjectivity. And science is the way that this was achieved. So again, our subversive reading of Shapin takes us exactly in the opposite direction, which is not actually the opposite direction. It is like religion only took us so far, dogma took us so far, but now science has arisen, and we come into our heritage, our world-shaking heritage of constant progression, constant perfecting of ourselves and the world. And science, this modest, humble institution based on majority opinion, is the leading edge of our ability to actually unfold this divine progression, and doing so in the most human of ways. The majority beliefs that we hold are now based on these workings of a group of specialized individuals that give us the best approximations of the truth, the ideals that we have had throughout history. And this is part of the unfolding of the divine progression, of divine perfection. So on this note, as you see, as usual, there are many digressions, many associations spring up because the idea is complex, and it's also very interesting to see how things actually work, how evolution actually works, and there are so many misconceptions that we drag with us. In fact, the very idea of evolution has been misconstrued both by evolutionists and by, of course, by those who would object to it, the creationists, or the ideas of intelligent design and so on. All this is beside the point. And of course, it is this very disenchantment, this very uprooting of belief through traditional channels and its transformation to belief in truth and matters produced through the institutions of science that give rise to our current situation, modernity, that is constantly detaching itself not just from previous enchantments, but from the biological, from all the traditional heritage of humanity, and bringing us into a new position where we actually become aware of the fact that we, through mind, through inter-subjectivity, are creating reality, are establishing what the world is. In fact, unfolding new and ever-growing perfections as we evolve. Okay, more on Shapin in our next talk.